Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast with returning guest, Andy Marley. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you for coming on. It was good chat last time, chatting everything vitamin D. We might revisit some of that too. But just to give a brief background about yourself for listeners who maybe didn't listen to the first episode, do you want to maybe just do a quick rundown?
Yeah, so I'm a lecturer at Abertay University in Dundee. I work alongside John and Andrew Usher, who've been on the podcast before. And in terms of teaching, I mainly teach on physiology of health and strength and conditioning modules. In terms of research, my research is more based around kind of sports nutrition / performance with S&C. So I got my PhD 2 years ago looking at high-dose vitamin D and how that influences aerobic and anaerobic exercise performance in kind of combat sport athletes. And before that, I did a master's in sports nutrition down at Oxford Brookes, and I did undergraduate degrees in strength and conditioning and another one in sports biomedicine. So I've kind of got a bit of a wide background.
Perfect. You actually made me, that last episode had me buy the 50,000 IU vitamin D after that, because it's so interesting. Yeah, well, the thing is now, because you were saying, you take 50,000 IUs at once because then you remember because you don't have to take it once a week. I'm the opposite. Because you only take it once a week, I always fucking forget. So now I'm going to have to try maybe go for a 10,000 IUs so I can take it 5 days a week instead and actually cover. But I'm getting a shit ton of sun now. But you still recommend, right? Even with the high dose, even if it's, say, summer, you're getting a lot of sun, you still recommend taking that 50,000 IUs?
You can get away with dropping down your dose to about, if you're going down the daily route, to about 1,000 to 2,000 IUs a day. You can get away with that in the summer. Okay. If you're outside a lot. Because at the end of the day, even if people are outside, people tend to be wearing sunscreen. They tend to be covering their skin, so they're not, even though they're outside in the sun, they're not necessarily getting the effects from the UVB radiation. So it depends on what your own practices are. If you're one of these people who likes to go out and sunbathe naked at midday, apparently people do that, then you're probably all right for not taking any. But if you do wear sunscreen and whatnot, then it's probably a good idea. And then I would say definitely up it in the winter time. And so that's to the 50,000 IUs per week in one go. Or, like I said, you can go down to a daily dose. You can either do 10,000 IUs 5 days a week, or you can lower the dose a little bit further and do it daily. It's up to yourself.
Yeah. I found that. Well, then again, I've been so bad with my supplements lately anyway. I haven't been taking any except for my normal protein powder. So I just need to get back into the rhythm of actually taking the damn things and actually trying to get some of those vitamin D benefits. But recently you published a paper around alcohol. And it'll be interesting for you. I haven't actually gone through the paper yet. But it'd be good to hear from you kind of what you looked at there and maybe some of the practical outcomes from it.
Yeah, so obviously, being from Scotland, we like to drink. So it seemed to make sense to try.
Like most Commonwealth countries.
It seems to be a big problem, doesn't it? No, I always wanted to see kind of what happens when you ingest alcohol prior to doing kind of submaximal exercise, because at the end of the day, alcohol provides calories, as does protein, fats, carbohydrates, but we don't tend to consider that, obviously, when we're doing exercise. Because people tend to not drink before exercise because you tend to have a loss of neuromuscular function. So
at least you're Craig Jones, right? Craig Jones on a podcast recently said he has a couple of beers before he heads out.
Nose beers, normal beers. He likes all. If that's what you want to do, then cool. But generally speaking, people don't do that, and we don't really know how the body would react to trying to exercise. So when there's a greater calorie expenditure in the presence of alcohol, because when we drink, we preferentially oxidize the alcohol because it's a poison. It becomes like the primary fuel source. And I'll say primary fuel source. Alcohol has a maximal oxidizing rate of 0.1 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass per hour. So the actual maximal oxidizing rate of alcohol is quite low. Okay, so does that then change how much fat and carbohydrate we use during submaximal exercise? So we didn't really know. We wanted to find that out. So what we did is we got 8 people who drank recreationally. So they weren't like to be, if they're alcoholics, can't do it. If you don't drink at all, can't do it either.
Was it just questionnaire? Are you an alcoholic?
It's kind of one of those kind of sensitive questions. And it's like, so how much do you drink per week, roughly? And like, trying to be as unjudgmental as possible. There was actually one person I was like, actually, I don't think you can do this study from what the answers you've given me. Here's a leaflet. You maybe want to go and speak to somebody about that. But what we did was it was a randomized crossover design, so they all acted as their own control. One time they had the alcohol condition, the other time they had a water condition. So they came into the lab a total of 3 times. First time they did a VO2 max test, so we know how hard we should be getting them to work. And the second time they came in and they were told to record their diet the day before and also their sleep. Came in, they gave a urine sample, so we looked at volume and osmolality. Did usual measures, height, weight, whatnot. Fed them with a heart rate monitor. Did some, and then we got them to drink either 3 doubles, so 6 standard UK measures of vodka with diluted juice and water, or
in what time frame? In like a short time frame?
An hour. So
we
had 6 drinks in it within an hour, first thing in the morning. So that was actually quite a lot of fun, because during that resting period, before we had gone to the exercise, we had to take some extra urine samples and whatnot. And I remember taking one of the participants through to the toilet to get the urine sample, because he looked a wee bit unsteady on his feet. And he poked his head into the office of the dean of school and went, shh, like that. So I had to then pick him out of the police office, because he thought he was having a great time. He was blazed at 9:30 in the morning. So we took all the resting measures, and then they cycled at 50% of their VO2 max for 90 minutes. So a relatively long time, but a relatively low intensity. So there wasn't actually a performance outcome to it. So when they were doing it, we let them, watch a movie on the laptop in front of them, as long as they were keeping to that correct cadence and make sure the heart rate was correct and whatnot. And during that time, we would take gas samples in the Douglas bags, blood glucose levels, RPE level, as how hard you think you're working. And then there's a 2-hour period afterwards where we just continue to take heart rate, blood glucose, and urine samples. And he says, well, the protocol was exactly the same, down to the standardized breakfast that we gave them for both alcohol and water conditions. It's just obviously one time they had alcohol, one time they didn't, but all the fluid that they drank was matched. So it was the same volume of fluid. It's just in the water condition they had more water. One of the kind of challenges with that was that we couldn't blind people to it. At the end of the day, even if I got a funnel and poured vodka down your throat and you didn't taste it, you still have the intoxicating effects of the alcohol. There's no suitable placebo to mask or to mimic alcohol. Yeah. So it was just one of those things, like, we didn't tell them what they were going to have when they came in, but as soon as they had a drink, like, they knew. So it was, it couldn't really be blinded, but in a lot of ways that doesn't matter, because it was a submaximal exercise protocol. We weren't looking at exercise performance, so it wasn't as important for that. And what we found was that taking alcohol prior to submaximal exercise doesn't change how much fat or carbohydrate you utilize to complete the exercise. And this is probably because the maximal oxidizing rate of alcohol is quite low, like I said, at 0.1 grams per kilogram fat-free mass per hour. So obviously people who are larger can oxidize more per hour, people who are smaller will oxidize less per hour. But within that 90-minute time period, there was no difference, which I thought was quite interesting, because people, after they have had a heavy night out the night before, they'll often go to, a lot of people I know will go to the gym the following day to try and sweat out the hangover. And it makes them feel better and all that. And it probably does make them feel better, but it doesn't actually change how much fat or carbohydrate you use. And in fact, we also took breath alcohol measures, just as a measure of being drunk, essentially. And during the actual exercise phase, if you look at the paper, it seems that the rate of alcohol clearance in the breath actually seems to slow down a little bit. So you might have heard of people saying, oh yeah, if you're exercising, you'll burn off the alcohol quicker. That doesn't necessarily seem to be true. However, we didn't measure that. That's just an observation I'm kind of sharing just now, that during the actual exercise, the rate of breath alcohol clearance seemed to slow. we would need to do another study whereby they took the drink one time with the exercise, one time without, and look at breath alcohol clearance to actually say for certain if that is the case or not. But I thought that was kind of interesting. Also, there was no difference in blood glucose levels. The blood glucose levels declined during the exercise and then kind of had a small rebound after the exercise, and that was the same for both. The only real difference was during the exercise, heart rate was higher. The average heart rate through the entire exercise protocol was higher, as well as during the resting period. Alcohol caused a rise in heart rate, which then stopped at the end of the trial because by that point, a lot of the alcohol had been cleared. So it's kind of, I think, gone back to normal. And obviously, the cumulative urine output was a little bit faster in the alcohol condition. But throughout the whole trial, the total urine produced in each wasn't different. It's just that they produced more urine more quickly at the start, and then this really rapidly dropped off at the end. So alcohol doesn't have as diuretic effect as people might think. People are thinking, oh, we go to the pub, you go to the toilet all the time. But if you have 8 pints in 4 hours, you will go to the toilet a lot, regardless if that's water or if it's beer.
Yeah.
So they said we kind of show that the diuretic effect of alcohol combined with exercise is small and transient. So they were the kind of the main findings of that. But if you wanted to expand on this, if you perform intense exercise, then alcohol will decrease performance. And I'm not talking about kind of more skilled performance, e.g. boxing or anything like that, where there's elements of reaction time, neuromuscular coordination, whatnot. There was one paper where they looked at a cycling time trial, one time with alcohol, one time without, and the mean power output was lower in the alcohol condition because the more intensity you exercise, the more you rely on carbohydrate as a fuel source. When you drink alcohol, it stops the liver from creating new molecules of glucose. So gluconeogenesis is inhibited in the liver. Also, glycogenolysis seems to be a little bit inhibited in the liver as well. This is coupled with skeletal muscle not being able to uptake glucose as well. So when you've been drinking, the skeletal muscle probably doesn't uptake the glucose in the blood as effectively. So if the liver is releasing less glucose and the muscles aren't taking in the available glucose as well, there's going to be a drop in performance during intense exercise because we're not able to fuel the muscles correctly. But for submaximal exercise, it doesn't really make a difference. So in terms of alcohol performance, it's directly related to intensity that you're trying to work at.
That's why people can smash beers and then do their 5 or 10K runs as a fun thing.
Yeah, people do that. There's beer mile. You ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's that? You smash a beer and run a mile? Is that the one, or is it a different one?
Smash a beer, then I think it's every 400 meters you smash another beer, and then you keep running until you have it. Each of their own. I can't think of anything worse. I would spew everywhere.
Yeah, 100%. That's power chucking.
If that makes people happy, then great. More power to them.
Well, I've got your research to lean on now.
Yeah. So for intense exercise, don't drink beer. But if you have a couple of beers and you cycle home, it's not going to really make much of a difference to you. Just be aware that there are extra calories in beer and alcohol in general. So if you are trying to watch your diet, you do need to consider that. Also, because the heart rate is a little bit higher, if you use heart rate to monitor the intensity of your commute home after having a couple of beers in the pub, I don't know, you might do that. And you're probably overestimating how hard you're working. And this is probably because when we drink, there's a small drop in blood pressure and there's more cutaneous vasodilation, which is why when people drink, they feel a bit hot, which then means the heart has to work a little bit harder to supply the same volume of oxygen to the working muscles at the same intensity.
Interesting. Do you think there's I know it wasn't covered in the study, but even though there might not be much difference during the actual submaximal exercise, is there potentially a recovery difference between alcohol and no alcohol? Say after the exercise?
Let's define recovery.
So let's say recovery between performances, if they're going to be able to, I don't know, perform at a similar intensity for the same time after. I mean, for submaximal, probably, right? Because there's not much to it.
Yeah, you'd be fine. We saw that in the paper. Blood glucose levels were the same in both conditions following. Everything was actually exactly the same following the exercise once alcohol had been cleared. So if you're looking submaximally, just like if you didn't have alcohol, your recovery time will be a lot lower than if you did some massive assault bike sprint interval training session. But no, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference in the way of recovery. Following, again, just 6 standard UK measures of submaximal exercise. If you had more, then there's more of the recovery from alcohol poisoning. You're concerned. Like e.g. a hangover, which is essentially is massive dehydration. So there's that side of it as well. But in terms of a little bit of alcohol and a small bit of exercise, there's no real difference in recovery.
I'm sure you've gone through a lot of the research on it too, but in terms of alcohol after exercise, what are the effects there in terms of, obviously it's going to depend on how much you drink, etc. and everything else, but maybe just a broad general, I guess spectrum around that topic.
The thing is, alcohol consumption, especially in team sports, is so common after a game. You'll know yourself after playing rugby. What do? You go down to the clubhouse and you have a couple of pints.
Yeah. I got a couple, the first hand.
Until the beer draft started kind of brought out and all that kind of thing. Yeah. But it is part of the game in a lot of ways. And if you're dehydrated, then drinking beer will help to rehydrate you. It's still water, it's still fluid. Is it as good as having some kind of electrolyte drink? Of course not. But it's better than having nothing as well. So if you're dehydrated, having a couple of beers is actually not all that bad a thing. The problem then comes when people start to binge drink, and then you go into the more kind of dangerous behaviour side of it, rather than looking at the pure kind of physiological side of it all. I mean, at the end of the day, if you are drinking a lot, when I say by a lot, I mean more than the standard recommended amount every day, then there's going to be problems with liver damage. If the liver starts to become damaged, it doesn't then release glucose as well, doesn't store glycogen as well, which then means that your overall VAT for storing fuel is lower and your ability to get this fuel to the rest of the body is inhibited. So if it's just a little bit every so often, it's not great, obviously, but it's not going to massively decrease your performance. But if you're like a George Best type character, but you don't have the natural skill that he did, then there's going to be a massive drop in your performance eventually, because you're not going to be unable to feel muscle. So people are just going to say, oh yeah, I need to drink less because it's going to get me fitter. And in some ways that's true, because if you can start to kind of heal up the liver a little bit, once the liver has been damaged from cirrhosis from alcohol consumption, it doesn't really recover from that. But we can improve the function of what cells are undamaged, which will then mean better glycogen storage and better glucose release into the systemic circulation.
Gotcha.
So kind of key thing there.
Because you mentioned as well, obviously, within your study, that alcohol isn't more inherently dehydrating than what is thought. So when people talk about, hey, one of the reasons not to drink alcohol after exercise, whatever, is because it's a diuretic and it's going to dehydrate you further after exercise. So you're saying that's probably not true?
No, it won't. If you have a couple of beers afterwards, it's going to help rehydrate you. It's not as good as, like I said, drinking milk or electrolyte tablets or whatever it is. Of course it's not. But it's still better than nothing. It will help rehydrate you a little bit. Okay, especially if it's beer. Beer seems to be a better option than like your vodka and cola type deals.
Yeah. Okay.
Or straight whiskies. Straight whiskey is probably a bad one to go for as well.
For all the high performers listening to this, thinking about having beers after their training, still don't do it, but just for learning purposes. But I want to change tact a little bit too. Obviously, the alcohol stage is pretty interesting, but obviously you got sitting there with a couple of good cauliflower ears. So we're going to go into a little bit of strength conditioning for grappling, and it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts around. We can cover your training philosophy maybe to start. We can dive deeper from there, because obviously there's, I think with the popularity of grappling exploding recently, there's a lot of stuff online that is less than ideal. A lot of stuff around, I guess you could say, mimicking jiu-jitsu movements, and a lot of, I guess you could say, I still like to refer to it as almost like CrossFit 10 plus years ago, when everything was just kind of like a small sport of whatever you can do. So it'll be good to kind of let's start with maybe just your overall philosophy around strength conditioning for grappling. We can even start with either just conditioning or just strength training to kind of keep it nice and concise, or or go over the whole thing?
I think it's such a hard question to really answer. Obviously, despite all the different grappling sets of different rules, the underlying principles are often the same. Take somebody down, control them to either pin them or apply a lock. The overarching principle is the same. When it comes to, for me personally, I think that training strength for grappling has to be highly important, because the point of it, for me, doing an S&C session or working with an SSC coach is exposing the athlete to a beneficial stimulus that they do not get in the actual sport that they compete in. So what I mean by that is, when you're grappling or wrestling, even if you're working hard, you don't necessarily, contract your muscles to cause knee flexion as hard as you possibly can. That doesn't tend to happen that often, like you would do if you're doing, say, heavy squats. You then give somebody heavy squats, you expose them to that stimulus, you're then going to get, in theory, increases in coordination, motor neuron firing, all that kind of thing, which can then have the transfer to when they're working in their sport. Because if they're stronger and, say, put 20 kilograms onto their squat, and whenever they perform a takedown, they work at 70% maximal intensity. That 70% maximal intensity is still going to be there when they perform their takedown. They're just going to do it a little bit stronger, if that kind of makes sense to you.
Yep.
So for me, for grappling, I think training absolute strength is important. And depending on what other sport, what the rule set is, power should be secondary. Now, for jiu-jitsu, I think absolute strength is the most important, because it tends to be not that powerful kind of movements. Whereas for wrestling and judo, power becomes a lot more important. So I think it largely depends. But that's just my own experience. The problem is that we don't necessarily know what is needed for each sport. Now, what I mean by that is, we've got data that says, high-level grapplers in judo have higher Wingate scores. They have this, they have that. We have data which compares high level versus low level within a set kind of population. But because of the nature of the sport, it is so hard to actually say what is going on. The only thing we've really got is some heart rate data. And from that, people can then go, oh, well, they're working at zone 2, so that's oxidative there. Or they're working at zone 5, oh, that must be ATP PCR. We don't actually know. That could just be nonsense, because especially with grappling, if you've got somebody who's really strong lying on top of you, putting a knee on belly into your chest, that's going to put your heart rate up, but you're not actually using ATP PCR. It's just because you're getting crushed and you've got this increase in blood pressure, and you kind of go like to try and push somebody off.
Yeah.
There was one paper, it was in 2017, it was from Giulio and Francini, and they actually offered the idea that in a judo match, that most of the energy comes from oxidative metabolism, like regardless of what stage of the match is, like the first minute or the whole 5 minutes. Like there's actually, they did like 1 minute protocol, 2 minute protocol, 3 minute protocol, up to a 5 minute protocol. And that as the match went on, greater oxidative contribution, of course. But even in the first minute, the oxidative system was the predominant energy system during a judo match, followed by the ATP PCR, with the glycolytic system hovering around about 5 to 10% underneath the whole match. And if you look at a lot of the kind of blogs and things online, it'll say judo is glycolytic and it uses ATP PCR. A lot of the stuff will say that. But this paper actually says no, not at all. You need high levels of oxidative metabolism, explosive movements using ATP PCR, and then as high oxidative metabolism kicks in to quickly replenish that before the next defense or attack or counterattack. So all of a sudden we're going, right, so if oxidative ability is the most important system, then should we not be training that? And then what's the best way to do that? In my opinion, is of course using sprint intervals, because you get that oxidative boost, but you're also needing to use that ATP PCR, so more closely mimics the actual energetics of a grappling match.
That's funny. It's funny you say that, because when people think, oh, it's oxidative, many aerobic, I should be doing more zone 2.
And I'm I'm personally not the biggest fan of that for specific conditioning. The whole, conditioning is to condition somebody to the sport that they're going to be doing. Zone 2, you're not really in that for all that often, especially in an actual proper competitive match. It tends to be a lot higher than that. I think if you just want to have a little chuckle, then going to Zone 2 is fine. If you feel like you should be doing something, because I know some fighters are like that. Trying to get them to take a rest day is a nightmare. So maybe it's doing a Zone 2 day on a Sunday, for example. They feel like they've done something, and it's not going to necessarily overly negatively impact what they're doing in the rest of the week. But I think doing kind of sprint training is more specific, and you're still getting these improvements in VO2 max. You're still getting this change in plasma volume, so the blood becomes a little bit more runny, so we can move around a little bit better. You're still getting this increased capillarization. You're still getting increased mitochondrial switch on, mitochondrial biogenesis. You're still getting all that, but you're also training the body's ability to resynthesize phosphocreatine more effectively, which is then super important for grappling. So for me, like I said, in a kind of roundabout way, kind of to answer your question, I think strength must be trained for grappling, especially absolute strength. Depending on the rule set, we can have varying contributions of power training and sprints. That is as simple as that.
Does any kind of long or short, say high intensity intervals or aerobic intervals, ever play into some of that training, that oxidative processes, say, for example, in that judo context?
It depends on what they need. So there's a relatively good review that came out. It's more looking at high intensity interval training, and it's kind of compiled all the work from various studies together. Obviously, that's how reviews work, obviously. And it's said that longer intervals tend to be better for developing kind of more central adaptations and improving VO2 max and whatnot, whereas shorter intervals are better for producing power. So it depends on what the athlete needs. 9 times out of 10 for grappling, I find is actually longer intervals are what they need, because they tend to be quite good in a short burst, but they kind of fade very quickly in a scramble. So I think for me, longer intervals are usually best. And then you can always go down the periodization route for using sprints. Start off with longer intervals and then start to decrease the intervals and increase the intensity the closer you get to competition. You could go down that route. Though it doesn't really get done all that much, because when people think of periodization, they simply think of periodized weight training. Using block or conjugate or linear or whatever type that you want to use. But sprints should be periodized as well. If periodization even truly exists, which is a different topic in its own right. But yeah, you could go down that route as well, as you'll do a block of longer sprints and then start to train things a little bit more sharp, a little bit more intensely, with longer rest between, closer towards competitions. You're still getting that high intensity with sufficient work recovery to then get the adaptations you want, so that they're not overly fatigued coming into competition time. Because like anything, you're trying to balance that fitness and fatigue kind of paradigm, aren't you?
Yeah.
It's always
how are you seeing balancing if someone wanted to do, say, those longer high intensity intervals with the sprint intervals? Because I'm assuming they're done. So obviously there is a philosophy around doing a pure block periodization where you're only doing long intervals and then you're eventually switching to maybe sprint intervals further down the line. But I think you're talking about doing both together in the same training period. How do you see that being done in a training week?
You can do, but it depends on what they do. Often, especially in jiu-jitsu guys who are competitive, they will often train jiu-jitsu anything between 5 to 12 times per week. Multiple sessions. And if they're doing hard training, like hard rolls at the end of each session, which again, a lot of them are, because that's the thing that a lot of grapplers will do. You can't have a hard spar in boxing every single session. Otherwise, you'll have a very short career. You can have a hard spar in grappling, provided you're being sensible, you're not ripping on arm bars, or you're not ipponing people head first into the mat all the time. You can have hard spars, but that then will have a cumulative load in the body. How much of a load that is, we don't know. I know Chris Kirk has done some work on this, but there's not a lot of data out there. So if they are doing a lot of training, I would just tend to keep to 2 longer sessions, 2 longer interval sessions per week.
Mm-hmm.
If they are on the shorter, the lower volume of training of jiu-jitsu, say 5 sessions per week, that'll often coincide with them having jobs and whatnot.
Yeah.
Then I would still initially keep the sessions a little bit longer, and then start to drop them down in terms of intensity, not in terms of intensity, in terms of duration of work, and increase the work rate, increase the rest period, between each bout of exercise. So I don't tend to use both in 1 week myself.
Gotcha.
Because when you're trying to balance out their other training, potentially strength work as well, conditioning, and then off work, family commitments and whatnot, it becomes hard. So I tend to stick to one at a time, because at the end of the day, grappling doesn't pay. Not like high-level boxing, so they all still tend to work as well, be that coaching or personal training or, working in an office job. It depends what people are doing.
Yeah, obviously, because you work with Andrew Asher and Dr. John Bebb right there, does a pure sprint interval approach often come into play with any grapplers maybe you're around to work with, or you're...
So trying to convince grapplers to do conditioning, I find it a lot more difficult than convincing boxers, kickboxers, and MMA guys to do conditioning. They don't feel the need to do it. They think, I do enough hard sparring, I don't need to do that. And it's something I would like to try and change, because most grappling conditioning I see is some kind of kettlebell circuit, which is usually done really badly.
Done Tabata style.
Yeah, something like that. Or they do, like you said earlier on, some kind of CrossFit thing where they're doing, okay, we're going to do push press for a minute. I was like, okay, well, the point of a push press is to increase full body power. Why are you then doing this in a circuit style where you're trying to do as many as you can in a minute? You're not then getting the actual benefits of what the push press is designed for. If anything, you're probably going to jack up your shoulders eventually when you get tired, and then things start to go all wobbly, and you're going to hurt yourself.
Yeah.
So I think keeping it as simple as possible for me is the answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been helping out a friend back home, Jared Dell, he's competing at 80cc, obviously. Well, when is that? In a couple of weeks. So over the past 2 months, I've been helping him with some of his strength training conditioning. So before, he was just doing Tabata intervals on an air bike, but he'd been doing Tabata intervals for months. So the exact same protocol just for months, on there. So we ended up switching up and doing some of the more sprint interval style stuff. And, the good thing about it, he works full time. He's a teacher. He coaches jiu-jitsu and then trains jiu-jitsu daily. So to go in and be like, all right, now you're going to do 45-minute long intervals twice a week. And it's like, well, when the hell's he going to do that? 8 p.m. after training, and they have to get home, then get ready for work and all that kind of shit. Like, doesn't work. Whereas these sprint interval sessions, like, you seem to be some of the pictures of the screen. It's like 4 minutes. 4 minutes after training, and you get that massive hit of intensity. And as you mentioned, you get a lot of the adaptations peripherally that you want. You get some of the central adaptations. And because you're changing protocols semi-often, you're not getting stuck with, hey, maybe VO2 max caps out at 3 weeks like you see in a lot of the studies. Because you're changing intervals often, potentially you're still getting or pushing some kind of central adaptation on top of it.
Yeah. And nothing else. I think it also helps with engagement. I couldn't think of anything worse than doing Tabatas 3 times a week on, an Aerodyne bike or a rower or whatever it is that people are using for 3 months. I would get incredibly bored. By changing that stimulus just that little bit, I think helps. Like you say, I did my sprints this morning. The whole protocol took 3 minutes, like 10 seconds on, 20 seconds off.
Yeah.
Wash, rinse, repeat as hard as you can for those 10 seconds. It's nothing fancy. And I also think that's easier for people to follow, because if you're looking at pure high-intensity interval training, you've got to then have to figure out maximal aerobic speed. You've got to then have some kind of heart rate monitor on. You need to be monitoring your heart rate to make sure you're in this correct target for X amount of time. And, that can be hard to do if you're running. You're trying to look at like a small dial on the clock. From a practicality point of view, it's actually quite difficult unless you've got somebody else there to kind of help you go, no, pick this up and so whatever it is that's going on. With sprints, it's just so much more simple. It's just okay, there, so that bike there, you're just going to go as hard as you can for X time.
Yeah.
It's much more simple. I think sometimes we try and overcomplicate training as SSC coaches. It doesn't need to be that way. Sometimes it can be useful to use kind of more complex methods, but only with experienced athletes. Like, velocity-based training is a prime example of that. Most people will get absolutely nothing from velocity-based training, frankly. But if you've got an experienced person and you're wanting to look at power, then you could be working with a relatively short velocity loss threshold.
Yeah.
To 10% or whatever. And you can work with two athletes working together. They can try and beat each other in the speed they've lifted the bar and the exercise on the same relative intensity. It can be quite good.
Yeah.
But other than that, but that's again for a very small population. We'll try and keep it as simple as we can. I think it's really what we should be doing.
What's your experience around recovery after these sprint intervals? Obviously, it's only 5-6 minutes of work, maybe up to 10. How do you feel after doing the sprints? Do you feel, obviously you feel fucked straight after, but I'm talking like an hour later, maybe if you're doing a training session later that day or the following day, do you feel that it hampers, or do you feel that it has longer recovery times than other methods, shorter recovery times? Do you feel good, bad, etc.? Maybe just a little anecdote there.
For me personally, I feel that if anything, there's actually a bit of a potentiative effect. I feel I perform a little bit better.
I agree. I didn't want to seed it by saying I feel good, but I wanted to hear what you wanted to say.
Yeah, I think as long as I do it in the morning, if I was to do sprints and then go straight into a jiu-jitsu sparring session straight afterwards, probably wouldn't be the best.
Yeah, that'd be fucked.
But I just can't believe that sounds disgusting. But if so I tend to do my sprints in the morning. I'll go into work, I'll go into the lab, and I'll use the equipment there and do it in the morning. And then if I'm training in the evening, I tend to find that I'm a little bit sharper. Like I don't tend to gas really. I feel a little bit stronger as well, a bit more explosive. So I think there is a potential effect. However, there's absolutely no research to back this up. It's just how I feel myself. Provided I get enough recovery, I would probably say for me to recover properly, probably enough to put in a good session would probably be about 4 to 5 hours to put in a good session.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree with you there. Like I feel even after like an hour afterwards, like I feel fresh afterwards. Whereas if you think about some of the grueling stuff that you can do, like if you're doing those 30-minute and hour-long circuits of just ball busting shit, you're done for the day.
You're 24, potentially even 48 hours, depending on what you've got people to do.
Yeah.
Especially if you're doing a lot of reps. So in other words, there's a lot of volume going through the muscles. The DOMs will be there. You think of the damage that's going to be there. The IL-6 will be released. All that fun stuff. It's not going to be great for your performance later on. Then the counter argument as well, there you could take high dose antioxidants to try and counter all that. So vitamin C or pomegranate juice or whatever antioxidant. Cherry juice was a big thing for a while. I remember that.
Yep. We were doing that after rugby matches. We had nutritionists have taught cherry juice and stuff.
It seems to have dropped off a little bit, but at the end of the day, it depends on how you define recovery. Do you define recovery as not feeling sore and feeling okay, which was what most people do? But for me, recovery is an ability to repeat the exercise to a similar or higher standard. That is really what recovery is. So just because you got rid of the muscle soreness doesn't mean that you can still complete the whatever exercise it was you're doing to the similar or higher standard. If you're still your brain is still fried, you know how it's yourself. You've done a hard session, you're just kind of so, because even then, there's changes in excitation across the cycle M of a muscle when we're tired. It's part of the thing. Calcium dynamics could be altered, which is also what we need for muscles to contract. So taking antioxidants may help reduce the feeling of muscle soreness, but it's not actually going to help us adapt to the exercise and get us stronger or fitter, and therefore it isn't really helping us recover. That's kind of my take on it, because we need that inflammation there to cause the adaptation.
That's basically the argument against ice bathing after exercise and using external recovery methods. It's been my philosophy for a while. Like even during hard, I say during, it's kind of what I recommend for most fighters anyway. But even during professional rugby, when you have access to things like that, during preseason, I'd make sure that we don't touch any of it. Maybe a massage once a week, maybe just because it kind of more of a psychological thing, feels pretty good. But ice baths and everything would save purely for in season because you don't blunt the recovery stimulus because you've just been doing it every single week, and then it just becomes more effective that way. And then obviously you're not cutting all the inflammation and the adaptive response that you want from the training. So I mean, I guess it's the same thing with antioxidants, same thing with anti-inflammatories, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. There was a paper that came out not too long ago, and they looked at...
That's heat versus cold, right?
It was basically heat versus cold. It's either they went to an ice bath, a lukewarm bath, or a hot bath. And they found that the ice bath and the hot bath improved recovery more than a lukewarm bath. But the best recovery in terms of muscle performance, feelings of DOMS, and inflammatory markers was actually better in a hot bath.
Was that directly after exercise?
Yeah. I'll see it. I'll see if I can find it, and I'll send it to you.
Yeah. I remember seeing. I haven't read the paper yet, but I was like, I couldn't imagine doing a hard session and getting in a hot bath.
It sounds a bit minging, doesn't it? But they seem to suggest that it was better for recovery. Like I said, and I mean actual recovery, not just the feeling of DOMS, but the actual ability of the muscle to function. Because it's all about the muscle. Like that's something me and John do agree on. Like it's all about the muscle. We're trying to get these peripheral adaptations. Like that's the most important bit. Central adaptations.
There's some interesting research. Yeah, there's some interesting research around saunas as well after like submaximal exercise. Like sitting in a sauna for 30 minutes improves a lot of aerobic markers as well. So even just being in heat after submaximal is almost like an easy way of improving your quote unquote fitness is after maybe like an easy technical training, just jumping in a sauna for 30 minutes.
Yeah, it also seems to, there's some stuff to suggest it might help with heat acclimation as well. So, you do your exercise protocol, then you go into like a hot environment for half an hour to an hour afterwards, and then you start to get these adaptations, which means you're better able to tolerate exercising in heat. So it has not just potential fitness benefits, but also, like I said, heat acclimation benefits. Because the thing with heat acclimation is most protocols take a long time to do, which isn't really time efficient for a lot of athletes.
Yeah. You're just going to live in Texas.
Yeah, well, that'd be good. I think I would die if I went to Texas. I'm used to balmy 18 degrees Celsius. That does me. Texas must be about 40 degrees Celsius just now.
Yeah, well, we're only about 35 or 37 in the next few days. So
we're 19 today, and I'm too hot.
Damn, yeah, it's a mild summer this year. But I wanted to come back as well because we talked about on the strength power side. You mentioned the different rule sets may have you emphasize more power strength. So let me dive into a little bit of that. What kind of rule sets we're talking?
Anything where you actually have to take somebody down. So
like more ADCC wrestling based rule sets.
But even then, like for me, we don't have a lot of data on ADCC style rule sets. But obviously, jiu-jitsu is ridiculous because you've got Polaris rule sets, ADCC rule sets, IBJJF rule sets, EBI rule sets. I'm sure there's plenty of others.
That's why it will never be an Olympic sport.
Nobody can agree. Like there could be no global governing body which everybody will agree to do, which can then go into the Olympics. Even in judo, I think there's still two, and one of them is the one that's recognized by the Olympics. But even with ADCC, there's still that takedown because that can be a big score. But then a lot of it is still on the ground, and you actually watch a lot of it. Apart from like the kind of higher level guys, and even the highlight reel stuff, a lot of it is staying in one position, and it's one movement that wins it, be it passing the guard or getting the sweep, or you could even get the takedown. So I think in things like Greco-Roman, freestyle, collegiate wrestling, judo, power is a lot more important there because you start on the feet and the fight can be finished as soon as your opponent goes to the ground. So power becomes far more important then, because even in judo, you only get a limited amount of time on the ground before you get stood back up again if you haven't ip-on them. So even then, the big thing for me is being able to generate rotational power and power in the sagittal plane. Like they're the key ones for me. Yeah, again, it just needs to be simple. Olympic lifting derivatives. I don't like full Olympic lifts. I don't see. I think they're far too difficult to teach for most athletes.
Yeah.
Also, with grapplers who tend to have jacked up shoulders anyway, I think their shoulders would explode if you got them to do any kind of snatch derivative. So even when I say Olympic lifting derivatives, I actually mean clean derivatives. I think they're just far easier to teach. It's just, a counter movement shrug, a jump shrug.
Yeah, that is very easy.
It's so much more simple than trying to get somebody to go, right, okay, so we're going to the first pull, we're going to have the transition, the second pull, we're going to catch. Remember, make sure you're catching, that you're meeting the bar, you're dropping underneath, so you're catching it below parallel. Most athletes do have the mobility to do that. A lot of grapplers are quite flexible, but they're actually quite immobile.
Yeah.
I've found, especially in the ankles and the shoulders, which is kind of what you need for Olympic lifting. They tend to have quite good hips, to be fair. But that's often it. But even then, basically power exercises. If you can get them to do that, and just get like a hex bar or trap bar and get them to do jumps, you still get that triple extension. You're still loading up the movement. You're probably good, and that's going to help them with their takedown techniques. Just keep it as simple as we can. Doesn't need to be overly complex.
What's your feeling around? So you talked about that judo study. Okay, it's potentially mainly oxidative oxidative processes fueling a judo match. Do you see that being? It's pretty much nothing in jiu-jitsu since like 2012, and it's like a completely different sport back then compared to now. And then maybe within wrestling, we have some research now, but what's your take then on maybe potentially what those sports are showing in terms of maybe energy system profiles there? And then do you think maybe it's kind of similar for all of them? They're all maybe most peripherally demanding and limited?
The fact of the matter is there's nothing there. There is nothing on the actual energetics of what's happening during a wrestling match. The only things
until we do the bloody research.
That's it. Because at the end of the day, grappling is inherently very difficult to actually get what I would call real life data on. For example, you do NFL, you do Aussie rules, you do rugby, you do soccer, whatever it is. You can put GPS on people. You can have portable gas masks, which have been used before. You can use the heart rates. You can use the Moxie monitors. You can do all that, and it's fine. But with grappling, you can't have a mask on because that will come off. And even then, like all the wires and that would get broken anyway. So it becomes a very expensive thing to fix. Heart rate monitors, okay, fine, you can use that. But then the problem, like I said, is because you have all the skill demands.
Any isometric contraction. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's good. If you're trying to use the standard equations which have been done in the past to say, right, so this heart rate and this lean body mass, we are predicting that we have X amount of contribution from oxidative time, which is fine for running. Okay. But it's not any good for grappling. Like I said, if you've got somebody who is got your body lock and is squeezing, or you're on the ground and you've got someone knee on belly, or you've got somebody with their arms around your throat choking you, or you're there and you're trying to lift a leg up and it's not going, like you said, you've got all these isometric contractions. So that's going to spike your heart rate. So that's going to then actually change what's actually being shown. There was one paper, I think in 2016, and again, it tried to use heart rate to say, what the relative contributions were during wrestling. And it said that the most intense training in terms of calories per hour burned and the most glycolytic was actual wrestling training. But even then, that was including the warm-up, the technique, and the matches at the end. So they just put all that into one block, and then using resistance bands was the next one. It's like, whoever does an hour straight of resistance band work, so that often a lot of the quality of these papers is also pretty poor in my opinion. So like I said, it then becomes very, very hard to say what is it we actually need. It's got that one paper on judo which says oxidative metabolism is the best. Okay, fine. but we don't know about jiu-jitsu. We don't really know about wrestling. I would argue that it is probably similar in wrestling, and that oxidative metabolism is probably the primary system which is contributing to ATP regenesis. But for jiu-jitsu, that might be different because it tends to be a lot slower pace, because there's the takedown, someone's pulled guard or whatnot, and then if you look at the IBJJF matches, how often is the entire match in a guard and people go berserk when they've passed a guard or got an advantage point? It tends to be in one static position. So potential isometric strength is actually the most important thing for those guys. But even then, I would say because it's a lower intensity, it's probably still oxidative metabolism, which is fueling most of what they're doing. But again, we don't know.
Yeah. Would that change the conditioning, say, protocols you would use hypothetically, say, between wrestling and, say, an IBJJF gi jiu-jitsu player?
In wrestling, again, it depends on how far they are from competition, but generally speaking, I would have longer intervals for jiu-jitsu because of the nature. For me, jiu-jitsu is more of a grind, wrestling is much more of an explosion. And I would have shorter intervals for wrestling with a shorter work-to-rest ratio to try and overly to tax them more, because I think wrestling, in my opinion, I've never done judo, so I can't comment on that. But wrestling is the most taxing of all the grappling sports that I have done.
Yep.
Never done judo, couldn't comment on that bit. So before anyone gets upset and says that judo's harder, it maybe is. I don't know, but I think we need to overly stress the systems which are getting used in wrestling. So give them the shorter work-to-rest ratios, give them the shorter rest, make them work that little bit harder to really tax their oxidative system and make them have to replenish the ATP-PCR system. That's what I would say.
And all of that comes back to sprint intervals in that instance?
Yeah, for me, I think sprint intervals are just so much easier to do rather than doing high-intensity ones, high intensity ones, like I said, they are useful, but for me, most sprint intervals can range from 6 seconds up to 30 seconds.
Yeah,
and it's simple that way.
And then you're targeting more peripheral adaptations within the muscle than the high intensity, targeting more of the adaptations at the heart.
Yeah. Even in my opinion, it's more important to get these peripheral adaptations. Everything is driven peripherally. Yeah, I know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because it's interesting because just before we wrap this up as well, there's obviously most of the conditioning philosophy, I think even within purely in combat sports, is around the idea of eccentric hypertrophy of the left ventricle of the heart. Hey, we want to improve the delivery system. I think that probably comes from endurance sports where huge VO2 maxes, you're trying to just pump as much blood as possible to the working muscles in those instances.
Think of cross-country skiers. Those guys are scary.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I don't know why you'd even get into that sport. but within combat sports, is that really the limiting factor? And it seems, at least within Andrew Ash's boxing research, no. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, just even within grappling.
No, I would agree with Andrew Ash on this one. Yes, if improved pumping will of course be beneficial, but the problem we have in sports science is sometimes we try and make triangles fit into square holes. So just because a triangle works so triangle in this case is the stuff we've seen from endurance training. We go, okay, that's interesting. We're going to make this work for boxing. We're going to make this work for wrestling. We're going to make this work for rugby even. It doesn't necessarily work that way. It's more likely to work for rugby than it is for combat sports, sure, but there's always this kind of continuum. For me, the limiting factor in terms of fatigue for most combat sports is an inability of the muscle to recover, to either recycle calcium effectively, to switch on mitochondria to then have everything else that they used to do, so produce ATP, replenish ATP PCR, all that kind of thing. And even then, a lot of fatigue is driven by the muscle sending signals to the brain anyway. So, they've got this idea of peripheral fatigue versus central fatigue. I'm in the camp of peripheral fatigue is more important for exercise performance than central fatigue. Central fatigue, for me, goes more towards the health side of things. we were thinking of daily stress and things like that. But for exercise performance, it has to be peripheral fatigue.
Okay.
Does that kind of answer your question?
That answers the question. It's good because it kind of turns the current thought processes on its head, right? As I mentioned, everyone's kind of really focused on adaptations of the heart, exercising at low intensity. I think not just driven by the endurance community and maybe some of the older, I guess, protocols around combat sports, but also, I guess, around the really push, as you mentioned, with health and longevity and a lot of those big podcasts as well, really pushing VO2 max. And I think that's kind of just layered on top of it to the point where that health span longevity side has kind of intertwined itself with the sports performance. And now everyone's pushing that train. The pendulum will swing back eventually, but everyone's kind of pushing that train so hard now. Whereas when we look at the data now and what's happening out of your guys' camp, it's kind of like, is that really the case? Is that really the limiting factor? And is that really going to push our conditioning to a point where we're, I guess, maximizing the effects of our training to transfer?
I mean, even then, I know that I've not been involved in that, but I know that we've done studies at Abertay which have looked at sprint interval training in elderly populations, like 6-second sprints. We didn't have them doing like the ridiculous things we've got the boxers doing, because that would be highly unethical, quite frankly. But they were doing 6-second sprints, and they were still getting these improvements in VO2 max. They're still getting these improvements in functional ability. So
and it was just twice a week, I think, as well.
Yeah. So, it can be done. And I think that, especially if you're going down the longevity route, we in the Western world especially are too much like, oh, don't worry, Gran, I'll get that for you. Oh, don't you worry yourself. You're getting older now. We're letting people become sedentary. Now, which is not what we should be doing. We should be encouraging people to get up and about moving, because as soon as people become sedentary, all of a sudden, how often have you heard it yourself? People retire from whatever job it was they were doing, and then within a few years, like, their health has massively deteriorated. Because they've stopped moving. And it's an easier sell to get people to do lower intensity zone 2 stuff on a wee bike and having a wee blether to your pal next to you than to get them to do sprints. So for looking for health, frankly, whatever works. If you're more likely to do the exercise with the zone 2 long, slow cycle, great. Personally, I would get bored very quickly, so I like to be done in 4 minutes. So I would rather get my sprints in and then go about with the rest of my day. And get the other benefits, including improved muscle power and all that kind of thing, which arguably would be better for an older population as well anyway, because of the massive drops in muscle function and power which occur with aging anyhow. But still, that's there's definitely these two different camps at the moment. And I think they both got their merits. I know I'm not going to say that one is massively superior to the other. I personally fall in the sprint interval camp because the data from what I've seen supports not just these central adaptations, but also peripheral, whereas the long, slow guy, continuous guys, zone 2 people, you're still going to get some peripheral, but it's more central. So for me, because I believe that most of it comes from the peripheral, that has to be the primary thing we focus on.
That was a great summary too. And you touched on what I was going to say around people not viewing it in isolation, right? Because often we can get stuck. This trains this thing, but it's like, no, it trains everything. It just trains this thing a little more.
Because in case of being aware of that, I think it's really important for me to have an overview of everything. Like I'm not a specialist in zone 2 stuff. I'm not, but I understand what's kind of going on and what they're saying. So I can then go kind of appreciate and go, oh yeah, I see your point here. I personally still think I'm right, but I'm not saying that you're completely wrong either.
That's perfect. That's a good way to end the podcast, Andy. Where can people find and follow, keep up with what you're doing?
So I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, and if anyone ever does want to chat about anything that I've done, they can, of course, always send me an email. I'm more than happy to have Teams calls and things like that just to talk things through. So my email is a.marley@abertay.ac.uk.
Perfect. Now I'll link everything up in the description as well, but I appreciate you coming on and sharing everything.
No, it's great to have it. Great to be on, man. I really appreciate you letting me come here and chat nonsense for things I like to talk.
Of course, of course.